The wagon came in off the Caribou Road at 3:30, mud-heavy from the creek crossing at the lower ford, the horses blowing hard by the time they reached the flat. Cairn Falls was not much by any measure. A main street of packed gravel and sawdust, a general store that served as post office and lending library in the same narrow room, a cookhouse for the mill crew that smelled of boiled salt pork through the wall, and at the far end of the street, the mill itself, a tall wooden structure built close to the water, with the big flume running down from the mill pond on the hill, and the sound of the wheel always underneath everything, the way a pulse is underneath silence. The wagon stopped. There was one passenger. She came down from the box with a canvas roll under one arm and a worn leather case, in her other hand, the kind with brass latches that had been opened and closed so many times the metal had gone soft at the edges. Her coat was dark wool. Her boots were already muddy from somewhere before she arrived. She stood on the gravel with the wagon horse blowing at her back and looked down the length of the street the way a person looks at something they are taking the measure of, not admiring, not judging, simply accounting for what is there. The woman in the general store doorway had gone quiet. Two mill hands leaning against the cookhouse wall had straightened without meaning to. She did not look at them. At the far end of the street, the mill sat in its own particular noise. A man was standing in the open doorway of the office beside it, the small structure attached to the mill's south wall, where the books were kept and the contracts were signed. He was perhaps 35. His right hand was wrapped in linen from the palm to mid-forearm, a bandaging that had been done carefully but was showing the rust-brown edge of days. He watched the wagon the way the others were watching, without moving. When the driver climbed back up and shook the reins and the wagon began to move, everyone else held where they were. He didn't. He came down the street at the same pace he did everything, without urgency but without hesitation either. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the leather case. She looked at him. He said he had a saw. She said she had heard. He said the saw had not been filed in 3 weeks. The last man he had hired out of Quesnel had taken one look at the blade and found a reason to move on. Before that, the regular filer had gone north to the Klondike with half the able-bodied men in the district. The tooth geometry on the big saw was off enough that the blade was torquing in the cut. He was losing a quarter of his daily output, and the log deck was backing up. The autumn water was high. The drive was not going to wait. And if the mill couldn't clear the pond before freeze-up, he would lose the whole season's timber. She listened with her eyes on the mill, not on him. She could see the flume from where she was standing. She could see the way the water came down it and hit the wheel, and the angle that the wheel turned, and the way the structure breathed slightly under the load. She could see more than she was being asked to see, and she was not asked for any of it. He offered a room above the millwright's shed and meals at the cookhouse. No advance. She looked at the mill a moment longer. Then she said yes. He picked up her canvas roll. She kept the leather case. They walked the length of the street together, and everyone who was watching watched them go, and nobody spoke until the mill door had closed behind them. The room above the shed had a cot, a washstand, a shelf with a stub of candle on it, and a window that faced east, toward the slope of the mountain and the first line of fir trees that began where the cleared ground ended. She set the leather case on the shelf. She did not open it. Below her, she could hear the mill settling into evening, the wheels slowing as someone closed the head gate on the flume, the absence of the saw's working sound replaced by the smaller noises of the mill pond, water moving against the log boom, the creak of the long timbers as they shifted. Then, from the house on the other side of the yard, a child's voice, high and clear, asking something she couldn't make out from this distance. A man's answer lower, patient. Then quiet. She sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the quiet the way you listen to rain, not tracking it exactly, but aware of it in the body. Through the single window, the mountain darkened by degrees. She had watched a lot of mountains from a lot of windows, and she had learned that the last light always stayed longest on the ridgeline, as though it were reluctant to let go of the high places first. She let herself watch until it went. She was at the saw before first light. She had taken the lamp from the shelf and carried it down with her, and by the time the sky had begun to gray at the edges, she already had the saw indexed on the filing cradle, the first tooth positioned under the tang file, and the spider gauge set to the angle she had measured the evening before with her bevel. She worked left hand to right, 2 strokes per tooth, checking the flat with her thumbnail every 6th position to feel for high spots. The file whispered across the steel. Outside, the mill pond was still, not even a bird yet. She did not hear the boy until he was standing in the doorway. He was perhaps 9, wearing his jacket over his nightshirt, boots unlaced. He had his father's particular quality of stillness. He did not fidget, did not shift from foot to foot. He simply stood and looked at her, and the saw and the lamp and the case of files lying open on the bench, all with the same level attention. She kept filing. He came in after a moment, picking his way past the offcut stack, and crouched beside the cradle to look at the tooth under the file. "What is the spider for?" He pointed at the gauge. She showed him. "It holds the angle constant," she said. "If the angle changes between teeth, the saw pulls in the cut. It tries to steer itself." He looked at the gauge for a long moment, then, "Can I try?" She moved the lamp closer so he could see. She showed him how to hold the file. Not too tight, let the stroke do the work, and how to count the strokes, and how to feel for the edge without pressing. She let him do 2 teeth, watching his hands, not correcting unless the angle slipped. He was careful. He was the kind of careful that looks slow but isn't. He stepped back and looked at the 2 teeth he had filed. "How do you know it's right?" he asked. She took his finger and pressed the tip gently along the edge of the tooth, not enough to cut, just enough to feel the geometry. "It should feel even all the way across," she said. "Not high in the middle, not dropping at the corner." He pressed it himself. He nodded once, satisfied. "My dad used to do these," he said, before his hand. She nodded. She already knew that. He nodded too, as though something had been confirmed rather than learned, and then sat himself on the bench and watched her work, and did not ask another question for a long time, which she found she did not mind at all. By the time light had fully filled the mill, she heard Boots crossing the yard, not the boys. The Boots outside stopped at the mill door for a moment. She did not turn. She heard him step inside. She heard him stop. She kept the file moving. He stood there for a time she did not count, and then he went back out. She set the next tooth. By the 6th day, she had her sequence. She began each morning at the same tooth, the reference tooth, the one she had marked with a small scratch on the gullet, and worked the full circle twice before she was satisfied. The first pass was the rough work, establishing the angle, removing the worst of the wear. The second pass was the fine work, and the fine work was where the saw would either cut true or not. There was no shortcut in the second pass. A shortcut in the second pass was a wasted first pass. Her father had told her that once, in the shop behind the house in Pictou County, when she was 14 and had tried to finish a blade before supper. She thought of him sometimes when she was in the second pass. She did not think of him at other times if she could help it. On the 7th morning, the mill owner came out and stood at the door of the mill and watched her index the saw. She was aware of him without looking up. She set the gauge, made her 2 strokes, checked the flat. He went back in after a minute or 2. She noticed that afternoon that he had stopped doing something he had been doing since she arrived. A brief hesitation in whatever work he was managing, one-handed in the office whenever he heard the file on the steel. A half-second pause, the kind of pause that is not thought but anticipation. The body bracing for a sound that would tell it something had gone wrong. It had happened every morning, regular as a heartbeat. She had catalogued it without deciding to. By the 7th afternoon, the pauses had stopped. She did not say anything about it. She saw the flume problem on her 3rd day, coming back up from the mill pond with a pail of water to clean the filing grit from the saw plate. She was not looking for it. The flume was simply there, at the edge of her vision, and the edge of her vision noticed what her eyes were too busy to go looking for. The 3rd stringer from the top had moved. Not collapsed, not failed, moved. Half an inch, maybe less, the kind of shift that happens slowly over a season of freeze and thaw and the weight of water. and that you only see if you know what straight looks like well enough to recognize when something has stopped being it. The movement had created a small gap at the joint where the stringer met the sideboard, and the gap was where water was sheeting sideways instead of running down, and that water was running into the soil below the flume's foundation logs, and the foundation logs were going to move next. She did not mention it. She came back in the evening with her ledger and wrote down the measurements she had paced out during the day. 3 separate passes, spread over different hours so it would not look like what it was. She drew it in the back pages. She sat with the drawing for a long time. The next Sunday, she went up the hill before anyone else was out. She had cut the timber the evening before, a single length of Douglas fir from the off-cut pile, tight-grained, no checks. She had spoken to no one about it. She had waited until she knew what she needed and then taken it the way you take a file from a case, without ceremony, because there is work to be done and the tool is what you need. The repair took 3 hours. She reset the stringer, shimmed the joint, spiked the sideboard back with ring shank nails that would not work loose in wet weather. The sun came up while she was working, and the light moved across the flume boards, and she could see in the new angle of it how much of the old wood was tired. Not failing, tired. There was a difference, and she knew it. She was cleaning her tools on the hillside when she heard someone below. Mrs. Hollis from the general store was in the yard, looking up. She was a woman somewhere in her 50s with a face that had learned patience the way most faces learn it. Not by choosing it, but by needing it often enough that it becomes the shape of things. She looked at the repaired section of flume. She looked at the tools in the woman's hands. She looked back at the flume. She did not say anything. She went back inside. 20 minutes later, when she came down off the hill, there was a tin cup on the top of the fence post nearest the flume. The tea was still warm. She looked at it. She drank it standing up, with the hammer still in her other hand. She found the mill pond gate leaking on a Wednesday. She found the off-plumb in the wheel housing on a Friday. She did not find these things by looking for them. She found them the way she found everything, by being somewhere other than where her attention was technically directed, with enough knowledge to recognize what wrong looked like when it appeared at the edge of things. She fixed them in the same way she had fixed the flume, early or late, without announcing it. The town noticed. She knew it had noticed the way you know a current has changed, not by seeing it, but by the way things move differently around you. The man at the cookhouse began putting a bowl aside for her before the crew came in. 2 of the mill hands nodded to her from across the yard, where before they had looked through her. The boy, Kit, had taken to showing up in the mill most mornings and asking 1 or 2 questions before school. Questions that were never quite what a 9-year-old would be expected to ask. One morning he asked where she had learned. She said from her father. He nodded. He asked if her father had a mill. She said he had had a shop in Pictou County. He turned this over the way he turned everything. Did he teach you everything? No, she said. He taught me how to learn. It is not the same thing. Kit thought about that for a moment, then went to school. The rain came in late October and stayed. She worked through it. The mill was undercover, and the filing did not stop for weather. She was into the final stages of the saw now. The setting, which was the slower work, bending each alternate tooth the precise fraction outward to create the kerf width, checking the set against the gauge after every tooth, going back to the ones that were not exactly right and doing them again. You could not rush the set. The set was what separated a saw that ran clean from a saw that cut wedge-shaped and smoked the timber. The set was patient work. One evening, working late with the lamp, she heard him come in from the back of the mill. He crossed the floor with his coat dripping and set a length of fresh-cut cedar on the saw table and paused. She felt the pause before she understood it. She kept her hands on the work. She did not look up. She did not close the ledger, which was open on the bench beside her to the page of flume measurements she had redrawn from memory. He stood there. She could not have said how long. Then he reached past her, not over but beside, arm extended just far enough, and moved the lamp from the shelf hook to the corner of the bench, closer to where she was working. The circle of light spread across the open ledger pages. It spread across the tooth gauge and the setting hammer and the case of files. He did not say anything about the measurements. He did not say anything about any of it. He went back to the other side of the mill, and the rain kept on, and the lamp burned steady. She turned the page and kept drawing. The saw was ready on a Thursday. She had spent the final morning on the last 12 teeth, not because they needed more work than the others, but because the last section was the most visible in the cut, the teeth that engaged the timber first when the blade was indexed for a new piece, and she wanted them to be exactly right. Not nearly right, exactly right. She set the final tooth at 9:30. She checked it with the gauge. She moved the lamp to look at it again from a different angle. She put the gauge away. Then she stood back and looked at the saw. 54 inches of plate steel, every tooth filed to the same geometry, set to within a fraction of the kerf width she had calculated for the timber species they were cutting. The blade had a light coat of linseed oil on the plate to keep rust off. The file marks on the teeth were uniform and fine. It would cut true. She carried her files up to the shed and washed her hands at the basin and came back down. He was in the mill when she returned. He had been there for some time. She could tell by the coffee in his left hand, which had gone past the point of steaming. He was looking at the saw, not at anything else, just the saw. She came and stood beside it. He was quiet for a moment longer, then he said without turning, "How bad was it before?" "Manageable, until it wasn't," she said. Another week and the plate would have started to fatigue at the collar. He nodded slowly. He had known that, she could tell. He said, "The flume." She waited. He said, "The gate on the pond, the wheel housing." She said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I saw the ledger pages. I wasn't looking for them." "I know," she said. Another quiet. The kind that has no particular awkwardness in it. Just two people standing next to something that has been repaired and knowing it. He said, "I didn't pay you for any of that." She said, "No." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his left hand. He looked at the far wall of the mill, where the big doors were open to the mill pond and the sky above the tree line, which had gone a clean pale blue now that the rain had moved through. A heron was standing on the log boom, motionless, doing what herons do. He said, "I want to." She looked at the heron. He said, "I want to pay you for what you've done, and I want to ask you to stay on through winter. I need someone who—" He started again. "I need a millwright," he said. "Someone who looks at things and sees what they need before the things know it themselves." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the saw. She looked at the mill pond and the heron and the blue sky above the trees. She looked at the mill itself, the beams, the bolts, the long plank flooring worn smooth from years of boots and sawdust. The chain drive above the saw arbor that she had noticed was misaligned by about 3 degrees and had not yet said anything about. She would get to that next. She said, "I'll stay to spring." He nodded. He'd did not say more than that. He went back to the other side of the mill and set his coffee down and began doing something one-handed at the bench, the careful and deliberate movements of a man who has had to teach himself to manage with less than he started with, and had done it well enough that you would not notice unless you were paying the kind of attention she could not stop paying. She went up to the shed for her ledger. That evening, Kit found her on the flume platform above the mill pond, where she had gone to check the water level before the light went. He climbed up the way he climbed everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, and sat down beside her on the platform boards and looked at the pond. "Dad said you're staying." She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. The log boom moved in the water by barely a fraction, the current underneath it doing its slow and patient work. Then he said, "Did you know you were going to?" She considered that honestly. She said, "I knew the mill needed more than a saw." He turned it over the way he turned everything, not rushing toward a conclusion, just holding it up and looking at it from different angles, the way she had taught him to look at a tooth set. Then he said, plainly, "I'm glad." And he said it the way he said everything, not performing it, just stating the fact of it, as though feeling something were no different from knowing it. She thought it was probably a quality that most people spent their whole lives trying to get back to. She said, "So am I." Below them, through the mill wall, she heard the sound of something being set down on a workbench. A deliberate sound, unhurried. The sound of a man who has learned to put things down as carefully as he picks them up, because carefulness is not something you can turn off once you have made it a habit. She had been listening to that sound for 3 weeks. She had mapped it without deciding to, the way she mapped everything. Tooth angles, flume gradients, the degree of give in a board under the weight of a boot. She would stay to spring. That was what she had said, and it was the truth as she understood it in the moment she said it. The mountain across the pond had gone dark. The first star appeared above the ridgeline, then a second. Kit sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the water, and did not seem to feel any need to fill the quiet, which was the thing she had noticed about him from the very first morning. She left her hands flat on the cool boards of the platform and felt the fur beneath her palms, sound and steady, the grain tight from a slow-growing life on the mountainside. Good wood, fitted right, did not complain about what it held. She would stay to spring. The stars came in all at once, the way they do when you stop watching for them and simply let the dark arrive.